Welcome to SikhCast, brought to you by Sikh Research Institute, illuminating every path.
Thank you all for joining us. And we're going to talk today about Sidak again. So I thought, everybody could kind of get to know you first before we kind of dive into the conversation. So if you just want to introduce yourself and tell us what your kind of Sidak history is, your track record, then I think we can get started.
Sure. Okay. I'm Kiran Kaur. I first came into contact with Sidak when I was 16. I came for my first year in 2014, and I took SikhRI 101, and the first experience was the most transformative experience, I think, because it's the first time being in an environment like that. But it was so amazing in so many different ways, which I will continue to talk about that later. But like the ways in which it was transforming, it took, I think, a couple of years to settle in. And so I came back then again a few years later in 2017 to do SikhRI 201. And I did Gurmat-centered 101 the following year in 2018. And so the joke is that I'm a lifetime Sidaker, because then I came back again in 2019 and 2020 to TA, and won't come back this summer, but hopefully we'll be back in the future, because this program was an amazing part of my growing up in a lot of interesting ways. And so hoping to come back and continue to be part of it, but excited to chat about all the ways in which it is.
Yes. Yeah. I think people would be kind of interested, because a question that I think we get a lot is okay, what's the right time to go? I think some people get really eager about going as soon as they're 16, 17. I know the age range now is 18 to 39, but sometimes people are a little bit eager to attend. So yeah. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about your experience going as a 16-year-old, and whether that was something that maybe changed the remainder of your high school years, and how that kind of went into your understanding of your own journey as you went to college, because I know you took a bit of a break. So yeah, if you could tell us a bit about that, that'd be good.
Yeah, so I definitely was eager. So yeah. Ended up there when I was 16. I think I grew up going to Sikh camps and Khalsa camps as a kid, and so those kid camps are a lot of things that a lot of diaspora kids are familiar with, of going for a week and you learn Bhat and Kirtan, and it's a how to do Sikhi kind of experience, where it's if you don't grow up around Sikh people, I did not. And so going to camp was finding Sangat and seeing other people who practiced those things and getting to practice it with them. And I think by the time I was 16, 17, 18, I wanted something a little bit more from it, because I'd been going my whole life since I was 6. And so looking for this different experience where I got to learn about Sikhi through almost an academic lens, I think that is a profoundly different way of learning than the experiential way. Both are valuable. I needed to go to camp for 15 years before I could do something like Sidak, because I think it takes, that's for me personally, by the way, that's not a prerequisite, but for me, I think it helped to learn how to do things the muscle memory way, and then to go back and learn why I do them made it more profound. And so yeah, I think going at 16, was really young in some ways, and I think it was the right time in others for me. It was young in that I think I didn't know exactly who I was, obviously, when I was 16, and between the years of 16 and 19, when I came back the second time, I had changed a lot of the ways that I thought I would interact with the world, and the way that I thought that I would be. And so I wish in some ways that I wish I could take 201 again. I've said that multiple times. I wish I could have that academic experience again. I think it shaped who I was going into college, because of the shift in taking Sikhi as a muscle memory thing into a thing that you practice, into a thing that's part of your politics, into a thing that's part of the way that you engage with yourself. I don't know, that's kind of an unclear answer, but I that period of time was very critical to me. And so early or late is, I think, very dependent on where you were at in life. I was confused when I was 16 to 19, and I think I needed it.
Yeah, no, that's not a convoluted or confusing answer at all. I I really relate to that. I did not go that young because I don't think that I was like emotionally mature enough to go that young. But I did go the summer before college and then take a break too. And so I do think that like there is some value in like if you feel ready and eager and like you have a lot of questions, like there is some value in like coming in that state. And then once you've kind of worked through existing in that state, which is not to say that you like never have questions again, but you start to kind of like reflect on who you are and what you think and sort of what your like path could look like. Then like new questions come that are a little bit different. And I think I didn't have those new questions until I was a little older. But yeah, it's like crazy to come back and interact with people who've like known you at that stage and who are now seeing you at a new stage. And you're like all kind of growing together in some way. So yeah, that was a great sort of deep dive into that journey, because I think some people are wondering about that. And yeah, you can take tracks multiple times. I think, you know, sometimes you need some time to mature or have new questions. But you kind of touched on this, and maybe your answer doesn't have to be super in-depth, but like, are there like specific ways that you feel like Sidak impacted your life, maybe in the different phases outside of like what you've already said? Or is there like something that you can point to that you felt like was a tangible difference when you like came back from Sidak, not came back to Sidak, but came back from Sidak and sort of like walked through the world with that experience?
Yeah. So I think one like remaining thought I have dangling from the last question was the idea of like letting it settle in. I think I mentioned that maybe briefly, but like it took a couple of years to settle in that first time that I went. And I think the word that people use at Sidak often is about unlearning, or this concept of like walking yourself back in your understanding of something to then like go forward and like learn something new. And so I think when you're 16, the concept of you're like, I just learned stuff. Like I already be unlearning things. Like I just feel like I have a grasp on what I think SikhRI is, or what I think it means to be like a Sikh person in this world or in this society. And to like, it took a couple of years to walk it back and be like, okay, so I learned that this part was because of a particular community orientation that I understood. And this was like a cultural aspect of SikhRI that like is not doctrine, or is not like part of what I should understand as SikhRI, but something that I should understand as part of like the Sikh community. And so like those pieces you learn as you go out and through meeting all of the other people who come to Sidak. I think the question about the actual question that you asked about what I walked away with and what I came home with, I think my understanding of what practicing SikhRI was very much narrowed to the communities that I interacted with. Like I moved around a bit when I was a kid, and so I thought I had like met all the types of Sikhs there were. And so you go to Sidak and you meet people from all over the world for sure, but also people from all over like the Sikh world, and like people who come from all different sorts of communities and upbringings and relationships to SikhRI, people who've been like born into the faith and like stayed with it and then walked away, or people who never were part of it and who were embraced later in life. Sometimes you'll watch that process happen at Sidak. And so I think what I learned, and the biggest thing that I learned and like came back with, was that I really didn't know much at all about what it means to be a Sikh, and that like I could learn that again every day. And like, which sounds like really cheesy, but it's like every day you can learn like a new way of being in the world, in a more profound way, in a more intentional way, with like your eyes open, like so to speak, and like embracing that diversity. Because I think especially in the diaspora, when you grow up, you're like, either I'm like doing something that's like SikhRI oriented, or I'm not. And it's like usually on Sundays I do my SikhRI stuff, and the other 6 days of the week I do whatever else I do in my life. Not for lack of identifying with the faith, but just for lack of exposure or lack of intentional practice. And so I think letting that go a little bit, where it's like, even if you're the only person in your town, city, country who practices the way that you do, it doesn't invalidate the experience and it doesn't invalidate the journey. And I think that was it was like a wildly liberating thing to learn at 16. I think that's something that I think I wouldn't have learned anywhere else, maybe.
Yeah, no. And I think like, you know, part of what I talked about with Devish was that same kind of question of like, what am I learning that I have to like walk back, or what are the ways in which I have to be a little bit more thoughtful when I'm like interacting with people who are different from me, and what are the ways that I'm learning that are like insecurities about our own kind of legitimacy or like level of Sikhi, which is like, I say that like tongue in cheek, but what are the ways that like we share a lot of those insecurities, even though we have like very, very different ways of both practicing and also just like visible identity. Like all of those things come together and you're kind of in this like space that feels in a way like outside of anything that you can experience in like the day-to-day world, where you're like very intensely and very vulnerably asking certain questions and also walking through certain questions together in a way that like requires like bravery and a willingness to be like deeply uncomfortable a lot of the time. And I think that's the stuff that's like hard to learn. You can't just sit down one day and be like, I'm going to be open and I'm going to like, you can't like sort of do that on a whim. That's like, that comes from being challenged in that way. So it's like not always comfortable, and that's like a good thing. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. I think the interesting part about learning about like those different types of people that I was talking about is, I think, like coming into it from like a Sikh camp perspective, or like a doing Sikhi on Sundays kind of perspective. My conceptions of like the different types of Sikh people is like people who are Amritdhari, people who are not Amritdhari, people who keep their kiss, people who don't keep their kiss. And it kind of wasn't any more critical thinking involved other than that. Crazy. And so I think the questions of like who we are and who we want to be and who we could be and who we are like who we could be in like a bigger sense, also like what our community can be, like those questions require a lot of introspection, a lot of looking at yourself, not just from like a third person perspective, but from like going back and forward in history. And I think like those are the separations between the tracks, is like the different relationships to self and community, and like being able to go through all three of them as the lifetime Sidaker that I am. Like they all provide similar but different experiences in looking at yourself from the outside, in a way that's like obviously hard and obviously requires vulnerability and honesty. And that's not something that happens the first day of Sidak, but it's like the last day of Sidak when you're like finally getting it, and then you go and you hopefully come back again, or you retain that sense of like Sangat, community, openness, honest, like all those good things. It takes the 2 weeks to get there, and then it's like it's an amazing place to be. And so you hope to like pocket some of that feeling with you for the rest of the year.
Yeah, that's a great way to say it. Well, since you mentioned that you are a lifetime Sidaker, you've done all three tracks, I did want to ask you like kind of what your like maybe tangible takeaways were from, you don't have to do all three, but maybe like one or two or just one. Like what were your takeaways that were specific to those tracks? How did they help you grow? I'll talk a little bit about all three, because I think they explain what I took from them interrelates. And it's to say, like, I don't know if I have a favorite, but I think they all have, like, I don't know, when people ask like which one to do first, it's sort of like whichever one you think will speak to you first, and the reason that you have for going to Sidak can inform like which one is the most apt at the time. I think Sikhi 101 is like the intro course, which most people do first. I did it first when I was 16, and I think that was about like that learning and unlearning curve, and about this acceptance of not knowing pretty much anything, and that takes a week on its own. And so it's like you learn. And I remember like the first lecture in Sikhi 101, you talk about like the infrastructure that we use to talk about Sikh thought, or to talk about Sikh decision. This concept of using Gurbani, of using history, of using like the way in which our people have practiced something, and pulling in all of these sources to like create some sense of thought is completely different from a like community-minded way of thinking, where it's like, oh, my community in my place of worship in my town has done it this way, and so like that curve is just like accepting that there is a different way of thinking about things that might offer a little bit more. That might illuminate something that wasn't there before in terms of Sikh. Because I think like I learned Sikhi from my parents, who learned Sikhi from their parents, and so like that's one line of thinking that is valuable
and is absolutely like my life experience is like learning from those people. But when I think about like what does Sikhi say about something, it's not going to be just what my grandparents think of it, because their experience is informed by their lifetime, which is wildly different from mine. And the idea being that Sikhi would transcend those differences anyways. And so I think that's like what 101 is like, we have to start completely from scratch, and it's like an introductory course to sort of level the field of like basic knowledge in some ways. Basic used very loosely here, but like a place to begin with an understanding of history. And I think I said like 101 was my most like the most transformative experience, because that's what I mean, like I came back because of 101, and because the way that I saw people change over the course of those 2 weeks with letting go of like those previous things that I was saying before about like keeping your hair or not keeping your hair, or going to Gurdwara every Sunday or not, and like those differences like don't matter when you're in the mountains for 2 weeks and you're just trying to like learn something about yourself. Like like that's not the stuff that you talk about, that's not the stuff that you think about, which someone who's like, I'm very like self-conscious about those things, about like where I stand and that like the levels of Sikhi and like the when I talk to other Sikh people, I feel like I think about that a lot, and I got to let go of that. 201, I think, takes that and like makes you spiral a little bit. In terms of like the level of introspection that 201 generates. It's usually our group was smaller, and it was like about 5 or 6 of us, I think, and that was also a very shaping experience, because I was 19 when I took 201, and that's like the age at which I started thinking about my politics, not in terms of like American politics, but like my ethos and like what I thought I represented or wanted to represent in the world. And I think that's like what 201 tries to get you to think about, is like, what is your politic? If your politic is informed by Sikhi, what does that mean? We have to like go way back into history and like think about like, what did Sikhi mean to all these people who chose it as their politic? And I think it was so emotional in such an interesting way, because you wouldn't think of like these deep dives into history and these deep dives into like Sikh psyche would be so emotional for like, I don't know, like I was 19 and I had grown up in the States my entire life, and I had no exposure to the type of people that we were learning about in some ways, but it felt very much like home. And so that I don't know if I have like the exact words for it, but it was like the most emotional process of figuring out what I wanted to stand for. And I don't think I got all of the answers there, but that was like part of what made it more profound, was like all of us walked away like beginning that journey. And then Gurbani 101 was a different like vibe. I don't know, like Surinder Pal Virji's like class is amazing, and I loved getting to learn from him, because he brings so much joy to learning about Gurbani in a way that like when I was a kid, again, like you learn Bart because you're supposed to learn Bart, and like you feel good about yourself when you learn it, and then you belong. And like he brought this like joy in understanding, and this like wonder in not understanding, like if you don't get it, like, and you don't get it, and maybe you'll get it a little more tomorrow, or maybe you'll get it differently tomorrow. And so I think like, whereas Sikhi 101 was like this introduction into like, what is Sikhi? What are we doing here? What is Sikh thought? And 201 was, what is, like, who are you? What is your politic? Gurbani 101 asks again, like, who are you? And what is your relationship? Actually, what is your relationship to Guru? And like, what is your relationship to the, like, this wisdom? And if you feel like you don't have one, then you start. And so, like, again, like a funny, like, emotional class, like it's so much of it is like grammar and words and vocabulary, and talking to SP Virji about all of these, or Surinder Pal Virji about the differences between like the structures of different Shabas, or the structures of the way things are talked about depending on who's speaking. And I think it's an intimacy with Bani that I'd never had before, because I just never taken, I had no way of knowing where to start with taking that kind of time at it. And so I think like that's sort of where I left off, and was like, what is your relationship to Guru? And I think, like, again, the best part, I think, about the way these tracks are structured is not for them to be, like, terminal experiences where you finish the 2 weeks and you're like, okay, I've, like, learned what I need to, like, move on to the next thing. It, like, gives you so much to do when you leave. And you can take, like, the full year to digest, think about it, and go back and read things again. And they do come up. Like, even if you don't ever look back at your notes again, like, you'll think of it in funny ways, and that I feel like that's like what made it feel like such a home like an intellectual home, and so like wanting to be fueled by that.
Yeah, I mean, that's all.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm glad you like took the time to take us through each one, because we haven't had anybody on so far who's done all three. Yeah, what you said about kind of like these questions of like what our politics are in like a much larger sense of the word, because I only took 101 and 201, not brave enough to take Urbani 101 yet, but this kind of melting away of like our sort of tangible and visible differences, and maybe even not visible, like the way that we maybe practice might be different from person to person in the room. But then you spend a week learning about kind of the most difficult elements of our history and the most overwhelming elements of our present. And you're like, oh, it actually, all these like small things that we fixate on do not matter in the way that like how we come together as like a collective to respond to our current situations, informed by like our history. Like that's the larger question, and it is really like emotional and overwhelming. I think we took 201 at the same time, and it was like a lot of it's like a lot of deep introspection, and it feels impossible too. Like by the end of week, maybe midweek too, you're like, okay, what do we do? But that's kind of the point,
Yeah.
right? Like there is something beautiful in this idea that like, yes, things are overwhelming, and look at the weight of our history and the weight of our present, but like look at how much can change if like enough people just like come together and agree on these like foundational things, even if the way that we do things is a little bit different. So yeah, that like really hit me when you said it. I was like, I just relived the emotions of that week.
Yeah. I feel like 201 every time we took 201 the same year, and so it was a small group of us, and by no means did everyone come from the same background or the same perspectives. And so like while you're learning all of this like unbelievably deep spiraling history and like this re-understanding of where we've come from, beyond like the Sakis that you grow up with, you also then like engage with all the different types of perspectives that people have on those things to begin with, and like where we all had this ubiquitous upbringing where we learned about things the same way. That's part of like what makes it emotional, I think. Like every time we walk out of a 201 session, you need to like breathe, because it's like learning about something that you've considered yourself a part of your entire life, and learning that it is so much more revolutionary and so much more powerful than you thought it was. Because again, like if you relegate it to a Sunday thing like I did, from like, and that's like a practice thing, if that's what it feels like to you, and then you find out that it's this most powerful community like sense of being that has challenged so many different institutions and has brought down so many different barriers for different things. And like that's a very like generic way of speaking about it, but like these things that are so radical and so different from what existed before, to be part of something like that and not even know it, and to tap into it at the age of 20, living in a different country than the history you're talking about, is an experience unto itself that I think teaches you about like I don't even know how to explain it. Just the way when you, I don't know, those things that people talk about, like, in Times Square, you look out and you see so many people and you've become like profoundly aware that there's so many people in the world. That's kind of how it feels, but it's like looking backwards, and it's like, oh my God, all these people that came from me, we're not that different. Like we talk about Sakis and we talk about gurus and we talk about the times of the gurus in the post-guru period. Like those people were like superheroes, and they were in some ways, but also they were not in other ways, and they were just communities that were trying to find common ground and push for their community and push for what their ethos was in a way that protected the people that they cared about and protected the things that they hold sacred. And so seeing that there isn't as many differences is part of like what makes it emotional and part of what makes it such a profound experience. Yeah,
it like makes your blood move, because you're like, oh, I'm drawing from this same kind of like well, in a way. It's like very empowering. And that's part of like, I think that's part of Sidak as a whole, is like both the like intimacy of how we engage with our history and our body, because a lot of people, I think when they come out of Sidak, they're like, I've never interacted with Bonnie on that much of a like intimate and like comfortable level. Like even in the bonds, like having those conversations out in the open about like the hookum or whatever like body we're looking at. And so like having that kind of intimacy with both history and Bonnie, I think empowers us to like, instead of like maybe what we do when we first come to Sidak, which is like, instead of asking a bunch of questions to find out the answer of like what is right and what is wrong and like, do I have this right? It becomes like after the 2 weeks, it becomes like, oh, I feel empowered to like explore this question on my own, not with no like guidance, but with the like guidance of like Bonnie and our history and our lifestyle, like all these things that we've sort of learned over the 2 weeks about like what a Gurmat perspective is. So it's like interesting to see people leave that physical space and that physical time and to watch them like engage with issues outside. Like I get so excited when I see people, especially who are like, they went maybe the summer before college and they're like joining their SSAs and they're like taking issue with certain things or they're pushing for more inclusivity. And it's like all informed by this like new sort of compass and this new way of like trying to process a thing. And yeah, it takes away all those questions about like, am I like sick enough? Am I legitimate enough? Do I have enough authority? Because those aren't the right questions, basically.
Yeah. So that's that's exactly what I would say it is like, I didn't have the right questions before I got to Sidak. I was like, oh, I like, and I think a lot of people come with this perspective, like knowing that it's this, like academic minded perspective on SikhRI. I think a lot of people come to Sidak hoping that like Parvin Virji will just answer all their questions or that Surendra Paul Virji will like just have the answers and will give them to you. And I think the beautiful thing about the way the programs are structured is that nobody is trying to do that. Nobody is trying to become the compass for anybody else or for the Sidakers. It's giving everybody the tools. Like you can come with the biggest, most open-ended questions and you will get open-ended answers. And I think that's a much more gratifying and liberating thing to get instead of the narrow answers that you might get elsewhere or that you might have given yourself. And yeah, because you touched on the bonds, I think that idea that when we talk about history and like where those people got their thought, like where they got their thoughts, where they got their strength from, is the same place that we do is amazing. And to be able to like learn a new word in the morning, hear it again in the evening, and then the next time you do hook them in your own house or do Jeffrey said on the way to school, whatever it is that you do, like you might just recognize it, and that like will draw you back to the experience of Sidak, but also it might draw you back to the experience of remembering that you came from people who've been doing this like forever, and just the experience and the circumstances changed. And yeah, I don't know. I feel like getting to do something like that is like getting to walk back to like this original sense of self, or like this original sense of community that is so much bigger than like your Gurdwara Sangat. They're so much bigger than just your family. Yeah. And that's overwhelming. And so it's great to get to do it with a group of people and to like have a group of people who are going through that experience at the same time. And that's like a level of humility that I think is unique also to the community that comes to Sidak, is like everybody is like getting stripped of this sense of knowing at the beginning, and was like, oh, we don't know anything at the beginning. And it takes a little bit of time and it's an uncomfortable process, but I think like that is part of what like brings the community together at Sidak, is like this collective sense of not knowing, but being totally okay with that. And that's hard for me. Like as a personality trait, I have a hard time being okay with not knowing things or not understanding things, especially when they're things that I consider important to me. So it's like I heavily identify with being a Sikh person or being a Sikh person who lives in this country. And so I think like what that experience for me means, to not know everything about it, is deeply uncomfortable, but getting to that place where like there's this wonder in the gaps of knowledge is part of like the Sikh journey. And that's like fully a Surendra Paul Virji gift. Yes. To like be okay with that. Like you're going to learn a lot. There's no question about it. You will learn so much. It's like it'll be an overwhelming amount of information. Actually, it's like drinking from a fire hose at times, but you will still walk away with more questions. And I think it's just a different way of thinking about those questions that makes it empowering to be able to answer them for yourself. Like you were talking about having the infrastructure to go off to college or go off to your place of work or go back to your family and have a new empowered way of thinking that is not based off of what any one person told you, but like where you grasped all of these different strengths from. that's like the big change that I think people hope to get from Civic, and I've seen people get from Civic.
That's great. This has been really great. We even went a little overtime, but that's fine. It was great. A great conversation. And thank you so much for offering your insights, especially on the like different tracks. I think that'll be really valuable for people.
It's great. I'm so excited to see like how it goes back in person again and watch everybody get to experience this again. So hopefully people get to take away from it what they came to get from it.
Yeah. Thanks everyone for joining us, and thank you, Kiran.
Thanks.
Bye.
You were listening to SikhCast by Sikh Research Institute, illuminating every path.